Welcome to the Explainer Year 9. Today we're stepping right into a high-stakes courtroom drama, and I need you to put on your critical thinking hats, because you are the jury. We're traveling back to the late 18th century to examine one of the most famous and literally bloodiest legal proceedings in world history. You're going to weigh the historical evidence, hear the competing arguments, and ultimately decide the fate of a man who was once the most powerful figure in all of Europe. We are diving into the trial of King Louis XVI, a trial that, well, ended a monarchy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our order of proceedings for today's trial. We're kicking things off with Act 1, the setup, then we'll move into Act 2, the prosecution, followed by Act 3, the defense. After that, we've got Act 4, the wild cards, and finally Act 5, the verdict. Let's get right to it.
Act 1, the setup, from compromise to catastrophe.
So, to really grasp how a reigning monarch ends up on trial in the first place, we have to look back at the fragile compromise right after the storming of the Bastille in 1789. You see, the French didn't just immediately chop off the king's head and toss out the monarchy on day one. For 2 whole years, they actually tried to make a constitutional monarchy work. Publicly, the king played along. He even wore the revolutionary cap of liberty to show he was, one of the people. But beneath the surface, the tension was absolutely boiling. And this brilliantly illustrates how incredibly fast things fell apart. Just look at this rapid chronological collapse. From the Bastille in 89, we fast forward to June 1791. Convinced his family was in grave danger, Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette disguised themselves as servants and slipped out of Paris in the dead of night, making a desperate dash for the border to reach foreign armies. But they were caught in the small town of Varennes and dragged right back to Paris. Fast forward to late 1792, and boom! The monarchy is totally abolished and the new French Republic is born.
That failed escape, the famous flight to Varennes, was an absolute psychological catastrophe for France. It permanently shattered any remaining trust between the citizens and the crown. Almost overnight, the public stopped seeing Louis as their king and started seeing him as a turncoat, a traitor who tried to abandon his own people. So by the time he finally stood trial, nobody was calling him Your Majesty. No way. He was downgraded. He stood trial as a common citizen, entirely stripped of his royal titles, and was referred to simply as Citizen Louis Capet.
Act 2, the prosecution. The case against Louis.
Now, let's enter the courtroom. The prosecution's strategy was ruthless, and it was laser-focused. Their entire case rested on proving that the king had been playing a highly calculated, treacherous double game, basically pretending to support the revolution while secretly plotting to destroy it from the inside out. And they brought a mountain of evidence to back it up. First up, secret letters. They showed proof that Louis had been secretly funneling French public money abroad to raise foreign armies against the new republic. Second, the so-called Varennes Confession. When Louis fled Paris, he actually left behind a signed letter explicitly stating he couldn't approve the new constitution. I mean, that's undeniable, written proof of his hypocrisy. Third, they reminded the court about July 1789, when Louis sent an army to crush starving peasants, painting him as a heartless monster. And finally, economic betrayal. While regular people literally starved in the streets, the king was busy bankrupting the national treasury on lavish palaces and incredibly expensive clothes for his deeply out-of-touch wife, Marie Antoinette.
Which brings us to the prosecution's chilling, decisive core argument. Just imagine hearing this echoed in a packed, furious courtroom. France will never be safe while Louis is alive. If the revolution is to survive, Louis must die. For the prosecution, it was a total zero-sum game. The king and the republic simply could not coexist.
Act 3, the defense. The case supporting Louis.
But as an impartial Year 9 jury, it's your job to hear both sides. Let's move to Gamba and see how this builds a completely different narrative. The defense had an impossibly difficult job here. Their entire strategy relied on framing Louis not as some scheming monster, but as a peaceful reformer trapped in a violent, radical nightmare. Here's their counter-evidence. First, they highlighted his history of compromise. They pointed out that Louis actually willingly surrendered a huge chunk of his absolute power to Parliament. Second, they argued that when he accepted those sweeping changes and put on that revolutionary cap, he did it in genuine good faith. Third, they tackled the elephant in the room, the escape attempt. The defense argued that Louis didn't flee Paris as a traitor. He fled as a terrified, loving father who was just desperate to protect his vulnerable family from a violent mob. And fourth, they claimed he was just a convenient scapegoat. They reminded everyone that the deeply unfair three-estate system, that ancient feudal structure dividing everyone into unequal classes, wasn't invented by Louis. It had been crushing the French people for hundreds of years before he was even born.
So the crucial point is this legal argument right here. The defense stated, plainly and simply, that the king had broken no existing laws, period. Furthermore, they argued that a monarch chosen by God cannot legally be put on trial by a chaotic, unconstitutional court. They were literally attacking the legitimacy of the trial itself. And it's a fascinating argument, right? How can you be tried for treason by a government that you don't even believe has the legal right to exist?
Act 4. The Wild Cards. Evaluating the evidence.
Now, before we even think about casting our verdicts, we have to evaluate the reliability of our evidence. Because a trial isn't just about cold, hard facts, it's about how those facts are warped by bias and propaganda. Now, what's really interesting about this visual comparison is how it captures two completely opposite historical narratives from a massive propaganda war. On one hand, you have heroic French revolutionary art celebrating the awakening of the Third Estate as the people bravely throw off their chains. But then, look at the British cartoon propaganda from the exact same time. British artists were mocking the revolutionaries, drawing them as wild, unprincipled extremists plunging Europe into total chaos. So as the jury, you have to ask yourself, which lens is this courtroom actually looking through? How much of the rage directed at Louis was driven by heroic ideals of freedom, and how much was just chaotic mob mentality?
And then, we have to talk about the rumor mill. We have to acknowledge that a massive amount of the anti-royal sentiment in that courtroom was fueled by highly unreliable gossip treated as concrete law. For instance, stories from servants were everywhere, portraying Louis as a, quote, shambling idiot who was way more interested in tinkering with locks, he actually had a hobby for locksmithing, than running a country. This kind of gossip dehumanized him. It made it so much easier for the angry public and the jury to just wave away his entire defense. It completely blurred the lines between actual, literal political crimes and his own personal eccentricities.
Act 5. The Verdict. The Classroom Choices.
All right, we've heard the prosecution's fiery case for treason. We've heard the defense frame him as a trapped reformer. We've factored in the propaganda and the swirling rumors. Now, Year 9 jury, based solely on the historical docket presented today, the power is yours. If you were sitting in that tense national convention, which of these 4 potential paths would you choose for citizen Louis Capet? Path 1, execution for high treason, the ultimate punishment. Path 2, found guilty but spared from death, maybe thrown in prison or sent into exile. Path 3, stripped of all titles forever, but allowed to live out his days quietly as a private citizen. Or Path 4, completely exonerated, found innocent, and restored to the throne to try and stabilize a fractured France. Take a second. Which verdict would you actually deliver?
Well, here is the bloody reality of what actually happened. In January 1793, the National Convention made their final decision. By a remarkably, terrifyingly narrow margin, they found citizen Louis Capet guilty of high treason against the French Republic. There would be no peaceful exile, there would be no quiet life in the countryside. On January 21, 1793, he was taken to the Place de la Révolution, and he was executed via the guillotine.
The death of Louis XVI was the absolute point of no return for the French Revolution. The revolutionaries firmly believed that to truly move forward into a new era, the physical symbol of the past had to be erased permanently, which leaves us with a pretty heavy lingering question for you to debate in your classroom. To birth a new republic, must you first destroy the king? Think about the evidence we've covered, think about the intense context of the time, and keep exploring history. Thanks for joining this explainer, and we'll see you next time.